Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. In August 1929, almost 100 years ago, Arab attackers launched a pogrom across the land. The British were in control at the time, but they failed to stop the attacks. And in the massacre that became known in Hebrew as Tarpat, the Hebrew year at the time, more than 100 Jews were murdered and many more injured. One of the worst massacres took place in the city of Hebron. It was a place where Jews, Ashkenazim, and Sephardim had been living for centuries, and many of their own Arab neighbors attacked them, came after them with an unprecedented lust to murder. In a new book by award-winning journalist Yardena Schwartz titled Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, we see how the Hebron massacre continues to reverberate far beyond 1929 and the West Bank city that is now home to some of the greatest extremists on both sides of this never-ending conflict. Yardena recounts the story of 1929, what happened in Hebron, what she learned while working on this tragic piece of our history, and how it illustrates a hatred and conflict that continues to the current war, sparked by a similar massacre on October 7. Here we go. Yardena Schwartz, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks so much, Yaakov.
So we're talking about your new book, Ghosts of a Holy War. And I am curious if, before we dive kind of into it, the 1929 Hebron Massacre, which, as you write, is what ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I really have to ask, like, something that happened in 1929 to bring it back in 2024 is a long ways away. So where did this suddenly come from, and why now?
So I actually didn't set out to write a book about the connection between 1929 and October 7th. I was very well into the writing of this book when October 7th happened. I actually started writing this book back in 2019. And it also was a surprise to me to start writing a book about the massacre in Hebron because while I had always dreamed of writing a book, I never really knew what I would write one about. And I just sort of hoped something would fall into my lap. And thankfully it did, with this family in Memphis, Tennessee, surprisingly, finding a box of letters in their attic. Back in 2009, they found this box in their attic. It was filled with hundreds of pages of letters written by their late uncle, David Schoenberg, who had moved to Hebron in 1928 to study at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel, and ended up being murdered in this massacre in 1929. And while they knew that their uncle had been killed in the massacre, they didn't know much about it. They didn't know these letters existed. And they really painted this vivid portrait of what Hebron was before the massacre, really transformed Hebron itself, but also this conflict. And when they decided they wanted to do something with these letters, they looked for an author to tell their uncle's story and to kind of turn these letters into something much larger than just this family story. And originally they actually went to Yossi Klein Halevi, who, they already knew as this best-selling author. He couldn't write the book for various reasons, but he promised them that he would find an author who could, because he felt that this story really needed to be told and that this box of letters was really a treasure trove of history. And thankfully he asked me if I wanted to take this on. And, of course I said yes. And over the next 5 years, I ended up, going into Hebron more times than I can count and spending hundreds of hours with Israelis and Palestinians there to really understand the impact that massacre had on Hebron today. And also to hear from, the descendants of those who were involved, whether it was Jews who were massacred or who survived, or Muslims actually who saved their neighbors. Because one of the most remarkable aspects of this story, and one of the few bright lines in this story, was that the day of the massacre in Hebron, when 67 innocent, unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered by their neighbors, more than 200 Jews were saved that day by their Muslim neighbors who risked their own lives to stand outside their homes or hide them inside their own homes. And so I found descendants of those courageous Muslims of Hebron, and also found many more, unfortunately, Palestinians in Hebron today who either deny the facts of the massacre or don't know it ever happened. And yeah, so that's kind of how this story began and how my work at it began.
When
It
they,
really,
so I'm curious, like, just the whole creative process always interests me as someone who also writes. When you get you get this archive, you dive into it. How much did you even know about Tarpat, as it's referred to, right? About this 1929 massacre, beyond what I guess I would know, which is yes, there was a massacre in Hebron, happened in 1929. Since then, Jews kind of had to flee, weren't really living there, stopped a long-time Jewish presence in the city, and that's about it.
so I think you actually knew more than I did before I read these letters that were found in this attic. I knew that there had been a massacre in Hebron. I didn't know that there had been this centuries long Jewish presence in Hebron. Of course, I knew that it's the burial place of Abraham and, the home of the tomb of the patriarchs, where the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people are buried. But I didn't really know that history of Hebron. And I didn't know how the massacre had unfolded, how horrific it was, and what its impact was. What I did know was what I had learned on a 1 day tour of Hebron that I took in 2011, which is pretty similar to the experience, I think, of many foreign correspondents. At the time of in 2019, when I received these letters, I was a foreign correspondent. I had moved to Israel in 2013 to report on Israel for dozens of American publications, and I spoke Hebrew, but I hadn't grown up in Israel. And, many Israelis know very much about the massacre of 1929. But, as an American Jew, spent my whole life in the States, I had never been taught about it. And what was really shocking to me over the course of learning about it was that it hadn't been a part of any of my coursework on the conflict. I mean, I have, my master's is in journalism, but my bachelor's degree is in foreign relations with a focus on the Middle East, international relations with a focus on the Middle East. And I had never learned about the massacre or about the man who incited the riots of 1929, Haj Amina Hosseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who really was like the first leader of the Palestinian people, the leader of Palestinian Muslims under
Yardena,
British
why do
rule.
you think that is? In other words, why was this story? And by the way, I think that I look at my kids here in Israel. I don't know that they would know necessarily what happened. I have lots of issues with the Israeli education system. We'll put that aside, but I'm not sure that they're getting their young folks here are being taught necessarily the wider context or the wider story of Israel's presence in or is Jewish presence in some of these places. But why do you
Mhm.
think it is that this story wasn't part of that curriculum, wasn't part of what you were taught in school or growing up?
So that's a really great question. And to be honest with you, I don't have the answer. I don't understand why more people don't know about this massacre, why we're not taught about it, not just in, Jewish schools, but in, courses about the history of the Middle East, the history of the conflict, the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I took all of those courses in university and never learned about the Grand Mufti and his role in not just this riot, but his role in shaping the Palestinian movement and his role during the Holocaust. We can get into that later, but he was a Nazi,
Yeah.
and I don't know why this isn't taught, but my guess is that it's a very inconvenient truth that makes what is a very complex conflict even more complex. And I think that especially in the media, there is an effort to really simplify this very complicated conflict into more understandable terms, simplify it into into frameworks that people can really easily wrap their heads around. I also think that it isn't very well known because there isn't much literature about it. I mean, when I started my research on this book, almost all of the books that I used for my research were in Hebrew. And so, one of my goals in writing this book was to really go into detail about all of these things that I couldn't really find in English, so that there was this literature now, so that when
Yeah.
people do want to learn about this, they have a way to. Um, but the testimonies that I found, there were many in English, so there is information there. There is the primary source material. There were books written by victims that were translated into English, where they just tell what they saw in 1929 in Hebron. And as for the role of the Mufti, there really is no excuse for that, because there are plenty of books about his role. Yeah.
So, I was thinking, when I think of Hebron today, or I think that most people think of Hebron in 2024, or in the last, let's say, 20 years, it's a site of a lot of tension. It's a site of terrorism from the Palestinians. It's a site of settler violence. It's of clashes between the Jewish residents and the Palestinian residents. It's a site of IDF operations. Of course, it's home to this very holy site, the Cave of the Patriarchs, Marat HaMachpelah. There is that historical background, but it's not a place that you kind of, yes, you look at to some extent, I think, as maybe an Israeli Jew and say, okay, we do have this traditional religious peoplehood connection, but it's a very tense place, right? It's a very abnormal place. Whenever I've gone there, and I've been there like you a bunch of times as a journalist over the years, you're driving through alleys, there's places cut off, closed off, markets that haven't been opened for 20 years now because it's places where Jews need to be able to. It doesn't give you a comfortable feeling. So that's today's Hebron. But I'm curious, what was Hebron like in 1929 before then? Because you had, and I was reading through the book, you had the Ashkenazi Jewish community, you had the Sephardic Jewish community. They didn't really mix with one another. Like, what was the city like? What was it like for Jewish people before this?
Before 1929, there had always been a Jewish presence in Hebron. It was a very small community. In 1929, the Jewish community was about 800 people. Meanwhile, the Arab majority was more than 20,000 people. So they were a very small, weak minority. They were not equal in any way to the Muslim majority. There was just one Jewish resident on Hebron City Council in 1929. He was Ashkenazi, but his family had lived there for generations. His father was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Hebron, and his family had been there since the 1800s. So he spoke fluent Arabic, and that was actually quite common obviously among the Sephardi Mizrahi Jews in Hebron. They all spoke Arabic or Ladino. They often looked Arabic to the more recently arrived European yeshiva students who were also coming, like David Schoenberg did, to Hebron specifically to study at the yeshiva. David, in one of his early letters, he said he sometimes couldn't tell the Arabs from the Jews apart because, coming from the United States, he had only known Ashkenazi Jews. He had never seen Mizrahi Jews, and he suddenly saw these Jewish men who dressed in these flowing Arabic robes and who spoke Arabic, and they owned businesses together. They got their haircuts from Arab barbers. They shopped in the Arab market. There was a lot of what we would consider today peaceful coexistence going on in Hebron before this massacre. And it wasn't just between the Sephardim, and the Mizrahi Jews and their Arab neighbors, also the Ashkenazim. The chief rabbi, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, he rented his home from an Arab landlord who ended up considering him his own family member, because this rabbi, he credited him with saving his young son, who was very sick, and the doctors had told the parents that their son probably wouldn't survive. And this rabbi, Rabbi Slonim, he stayed by this young boy's bed the whole night praying for him, and by morning he was better.
Wow.
And so, this is just one little snapshot to kind of just show what it was like in
So
1929.
So what happened? What changed? What led to this massacre? And maybe here, throw in for us a bit about the Mufti himself.
Well, I'll talk about one place around which this massacre unfolded, or actually two places. One in Hebron, where you have the Tomb of the Patriarchs. At that time, uh, because it was under Muslim rule, as Palestine had been for 1,000 years. I mean, this was during the British Mandate, so the British were the authorities in the land, replacing the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled for more than 400 years. But places like the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, these were under the authority of the Muslim Waqf, the Muslim religious authority. And in Hebron, Jews were forbidden from entering the Tomb of the Patriarchs. It was Ibrahimi Mosque. So the Muslims forbid Jews from entering. They had to only pray from the steps outside of the mosque, or outside of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And in Jerusalem, with the Temple Mount, there was this effort to convince the Muslims of Palestine that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple in Jerusalem. And that was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin Husseini, who began that rumor. He started to spread that rumor in 1928. Until then, he had been dogged by allegations of corruption and nepotism and misuse of religious funds. And once he started this campaign of propaganda and disinformation and fear mongering, not only against the Jewish natives of Palestine, but against rising Jewish immigration from Europe, where pogroms were raging, leading to increased Jewish immigration to Palestine. Once that campaign took hold of the population, the Muslim population in Palestine, that criticism against him really disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of set a formula for every Palestinian leader since, because that propaganda campaign led to these violent riots, which vanquished the Jewish population of Hebron, but also reached every Jewish community in Palestine. The Jews of Gaza, they had to evacuate. British forces evacuated them to Tel Aviv. Jewish communities and farming cooperatives were evacuated. But the riots that lasted a week and reached every Jewish community in Hebron, the Jews who paid the heaviest price were those living in Hebron, which had been, this beacon of coexistence. It was considered the safest place for Jews in Palestine at the time. It was a place where Jews from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv would vacation in the summer months to get away from the heat. And that was one of the things that I read in these letters and in other victims' testimonies that really shocked me, because the Hebron I had known before I read David's letters was the antithesis of peaceful coexistence. Like I mentioned earlier, I'd been there only once before reading his letters, and it was on a tour with Breaking the Silence, in which I saw, how Palestinians in Hebron live today. And it was a really depressing reality to see, how the restrictions on Palestinian movement affect daily life for Palestinians in Hebron, how they can't walk on certain streets, and how, they have to go through checkpoints to reach their families in other parts of Hebron. And so I had seen kind of one side of what Hebron was, almost as if I was picking up this story in the last chapter of a book about it. I didn't know all of the events that had preceded and kind of led to these restrictive measures. And so I think that, doing this research and digging back into history really helped me understand how we got to this moment, how Hebron went from being this beacon of coexistence to being the antithesis of coexistence.
What lessons, I want to kind of draw you into present a bit, to the connection between then and now, and this, the massacre of 1929 versus the massacre of 2023. Are there real similarities? Do you see that one feeds to the other? Is it the same? Might be people who will say it's the same ideology, it's the same hatred, it's the same radical Islam. I don't know, but what is it? What did you find when you look at the correlation or the connection between these two?
Well, the rumors that led to the riots erupting in Jerusalem in 1929 were the same rumors we hear today. So that rumor that, the Jews in Palestine were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple, Hamas perpetuates that same lie today, even though Israel has control over the land on which Al-Aqsa sits, and yet, thousands of Muslims pray there every day on Islamic holy days. Hundreds of thousands sometimes pray there in one day. So, this lie is clearly a lie. I mean, if Israel truly wanted to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild the ancient temple, Israel could have done that by now. There's clearly no, I mean, yes, we have lunatics in the Israeli government who would very much like to see that happen. And, people like Ben Gvir proclaiming that the status quo on the Temple Mount is over and that Jews can pray in the Temple Mount, that is not helpful. And it actually feeds into the hands of, actors like Hamas who claim that Israel is working to contaminate Al-Aqsa or destroy Al-Aqsa. That doesn't help. But at the end of the day, Israel hasn't done that yet and is not working to do that. And so it is clearly very effective propaganda that continues to fuel so much terrorism. And when we look at the hundreds of hours of video footage that Hamas fighters uploaded to social media on October 7th, they were shouting Allahu Akbar, God is great, and glorifying Islam. They were not calling to, liberate Palestine or free Palestine. They weren't talking about this conflict the way activists in the West talk about it. And so I think, they make very clear that the preeminence of Al-Aqsa and Islam in, their efforts to eradicate the Jewish presence in the Holy Land because they consider it holy Islamic land. And the same rumors in Hebron actually were partly what led to the massacre there. So it wasn't just the rumors, the Mufti spread that the Jews were trying to conquer Al-Aqsa. The local Islamic leaders in Hebron were also trying to convince the Muslims there that Jews were trying to take over Ibrahimi Mosque and turn that into a synagogue. So that also fueled the violence in Hebron. And we hear that today from the mayor of Hebron. Today, he is actually a convicted terrorist who served time in Israeli prison for carrying out a terror attack in 1980 that killed 6 young Jewish men who were leaving the Tomb of the Patriarchs and walking in Hebron. And he has no remorse for his attack, and he continues to fuel these rumors that Israel is working to destroy Ibrahimi Mosque. I mean, there's a reason why this propaganda campaign continues to this day, nearly a century later, and that's because it is so sadly effective.
Knowing that, though, Yardena, I'm curious, looking at 1929, you as you said in the beginning, you embarked on this journey without any connection. It was prior to October 7th. You were writing a book about a very painful historical event, but a historical event that now took upon itself after October 7th a different a different kind of form of also what was, but what can still happen today. So when you look at that, I'm curious, as a Jew who lived here for an extensive period of time, what does it say about the future of Israel?
So I think that over the course of my research, not just in the archives, reading the stories of what happened in 1929, but also in my research, sitting down with Palestinians in Hebron, it is very clear that there are those who don't buy into this division and fear mongering and this weaponization of Islam. They just want to live their lives in peace, and they see the humanity in the other. And so you saw that with the Muslims who rescued their Jewish neighbors in 1929. And you see that today with Palestinians in Hebron who, despite living in horrible conditions, don't want to listen to the imams and go and kill their Jewish neighbors to liberate Al-Aqsa. they're smarter than that and they're more humane than that. And I think that there is a very wasted opportunity in not doing more to elevate those people and empower those people, because right now we don't hear from them and we can't hear from them because they fear speaking out. There was a one of the chapters of my book that I ended up having to cut after October 7th, because October 7th really transformed my book, which was going to be much more focused on this transformation of Hebron itself over the course of this last century through the prism of that massacre and what it tells us about how Hebron became what it is today and how we can find a way out of that. One of the chapters I ended up having to cut was a chapter about a young Palestinian man from Hebron who really is emblematic of what a future Palestinian leader could be if more resources were poured into empowering people like him to be able to stay in Hebron or in the West Bank in Gaza. He no longer lives there. He lives, I don't know if I can say so much about him. He works for the World Economic Forum. He is the grandson of one of the most powerful Palestinian families in Hebron. Jabari is his name. His grandfather was the mayor of Hebron, but he no longer lives there because he was the kind of person who would speak out about, the need for peace and reconciliation
Right.
and a two-state solution. And he is vehemently opposed to Hamas and also to Fatah, which is not that different, very corrupt, and not that different in the sense that they're not really bringing a different kind of hope, a different kind of leadership for the Palestinian people. And he told me, he said, the average person, the average young Palestinian man, it doesn't matter to us who controls Al-Aqsa. What matters to us is whether we have dignity and freedom and whether we have a hope for a better future. And if Palestinian leadership, all they can promise is more armed resistance and terrorism, like that is not going to change their future. That's not going to help anyone. It's not going to liberate Palestine. I mean, at the end of the day, what could have brought a free Palestine was the kind of moderate, peaceful leader that would have accepted the two-state solution back in 1947 or 2000, 2008. And there are many Palestinians who wish their leaders had said yes to those proposals and hadn't just dismissed them, offering no alternative. So I think that the fact that I can't even say this man's name, because
Speaks
even though
volumes
he's
to me.
not living there, and he's not even living there, and yet I can't say his name. And so there's a reason why the loudest voices for peace in the public sphere, people like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, people like Hamza Hawidi, Jonathan Aziz, these are if you're on Twitter in this space, you probably recognize these names because these are Palestinians from Gaza or from the West Bank who are speaking out against Hamas, speaking out for a different kind of leadership and among the Palestinian people. And they're often shouted down by pro-Palestine activists who are not even Arab or Palestinian or Muslim, who
Right.
think that Hamas is the way, that Hezbollah is the way, that armed resistance is the way, yet that ignores a century of violent resistance, only bringing more devastation upon the Palestinian people more than anyone. And so, for that to change, these people need to be empowered so that they don't have to leave the country to speak out. Because the people I just mentioned, they don't live in Gaza or the West Bank, and they can't. They often can't even say where they live now.
Yeah.
And as long as that's the case, we're not going to see a different kind of Palestinian leadership. We're not going to see an end to this conflict. And also, we're going to see a rise of violent extremists on the Jewish side, because violence begets violence, extremism begets extremism. And a lot of the restrictive measures that exist in Hebron, those only exist in response to terrorist attacks or waves of terrorist attacks that required the Israeli government to implement those policies. And they're awful. I mean, when I was interviewing Palestinians in Hebron, there were things I needed to do that I wouldn't have to do for the Jewish subjects I was interviewing. When I interviewed, there's this one point where I interview a descendant of one of the Muslim families that saved Jews in 1929, and I couldn't go inside his house because I wasn't on a list of pre-approved visitors that he would have had to go check with the army before I came to his house versus the Jewish family living just across the street from his house. When I came to interview them, there were no questions asked. The soldier who was stationed there didn't ask what I was doing there. I said I'm going to interview this family. I knew who they were, and this Palestinian man has lived there long. He and his family have lived there longer than the Jewish family that I was going to interview. But because he was Palestinian, I needed to be on this list of pre-approved visitors. And as awful as that is, when I think about why, I understand. Like I understand because it's Palestinians who are carrying out terrorist attacks against soldiers, against Israelis living in Hebron. It's one thing to, recognize the depressing nature of reality in Hebron and the oppression Palestinians are very legitimately under. There's no denying that the way they live there is depressing. But you do have to also look at why those measures are in place and recognize that the policy of terrorism, of trying to just terrorize Jews living in Hebron to leave, that's not going to work. It's only going to make them more steadfast and more violent. And the only thing that is going to work is reconciliation and peacemaking with moderates. And when people say, oh, but there are no moderates, that's not true. They exist. They live in fear of speaking out. And that reality helps the corrupt leaders on both sides insist that, there is no partner for peace.
Yeah. Well, Yardena Schwartz, I want to thank you for joining us, the author of Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Folks, you'll want to read this book because it really does give this broader historical context to a lot of what we're going through now. And I'll just say that when I was, reading it and thinking about this topic, it is also to some extent that what we read in the Passover Haggadah, right, at the Seder, that in every generation there is somebody who tries to take down or destroy the Jewish people. These stories do repeat themselves in different variations, but it's important to see the bigger picture and to understand the roots of it all. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Yaakov. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found: Apple, Spotify. We're also on YouTube and, of course, on the website of Times of Israel. Just a housekeeping note, we will be off next week for the new year and for the holiday of Hanukkah. So wishing all of you a happy holiday, a happy Chag Chanukah Sameach, and we'll be back on January 6th. Until then, have a great week.